Hey everyone, welcome to the Holy Shift Podcast, a podcast designed to shift how we see everything. I'm Scott Neal, your host, also lead pastor of Forest Park Church in Elizabeth City, North Carolina. If you are new to the Holy Shift Podcast, let me explain a little bit about what we do here. I sit down with leaders, authors, therapists, pastors, and I ask them questions that help us see how they are shifting the way we see life, God, the scriptures, mental health, how we follow Jesus, what it means to love people and welcome people. We cover a lot of ground in this podcast, and I'm honored to have you along for the ride. In this episode, I interview Dr. Todd Bolsinger. Dr. Todd is Associate Professor of Leadership Formation at Fuller Seminary. It was an honor to sit down with him and learn from him. Dr. Todd has written several books. Two of his books have impacted my life greatly. The first one is called Canoeing the Mountains. The other one is called Tempered Resilience. We get into some of these books in this interview. In fact, I read a few quotes from each of the books and ask Todd to provide us some more information and thoughts about what he was attempting to get across in these books. I tell you what, this interview to me is just so rich. It's just loaded with good information about what it means to be an effective leader in our current culture. So it's an honor to have you here to learn with me as I was learning from Dr. Todd. One more thing before we get into this interview. I'm going to be giving away one of his books to someone who wants it. All you got to do is simply share this podcast on a social media platform. It doesn't matter which one, just share it and then let me know that you've shared it. All right, send me a message or tag me in it, ever how you want to let me know that you've shared it. I'll put your name in a drawing, and before next week, when we release the next episode of the podcast, I'll pull out a name, and whoever wins, you can have one of the books of your choice. I'll cover the postage on it. I'll mail it directly to you, and you can enjoy the information in Dr. Todd's books. All right, I want you to sit back, relax. I want you to learn. I want you to grow, be stretched, and together we'll have some things shifted in the way we think and the way we see life. All right, let's get into the interview with Dr. Todd Bolsinger. All right. Well, welcome, Dr. Bolsinger. It's great to have you on the podcast today.
Nice to be with you. Thanks for having me.
You are welcome. It's a real honor. I'd like for you to kind of introduce yourself a little bit to our audience, because I'm sure there are some people who are not familiar with your work. So if you will, just take a few moments and give me a little overview of what you do at Fuller Seminary and why is it you have such a passion, not only for training leaders, but also for writing about leadership. What's going on inside of you that makes that such a passion?
Yeah. So thank you for asking. So I've been at Fuller as a professor and administrator since 2014.
Yeah.
For 27 years before that, I was a pastor in a church. I had 10 years at Hollywood Presbyterian on their staff as a staff person and an associate pastor, and then 17 years as a senior pastor in San Clemente, California. And then I was invited to come to the seminary where I'd gotten my MDiv and my PhD to work with them on how do you form the leaders of the future. That's what seminaries do.
Right.
And so I'm an associate professor of leadership formation, and now I run the Church Leadership Institute. And my wife and I and some friends have a consulting and speaking and coaching company on the side. And so I wake up every single day trying to help faith leaders thrive as change leaders. And I get to do it through research and teaching and through speaking and coaching and consulting.
Well, that's wonderful. I tell you, your books came across my desk just this past year. I wasn't familiar with your writings. I'm not even sure where I came across your name. It was either in an article I was reading or possibly another book may have quoted you. And I picked up, the first book I picked up was Tempered Resilience. And we'll get into that in just a moment. And then as a result of reading that, I got into Canoeing the Mountains. And both of them just were so refreshing to me, challenging and encouraging as well. So I want to jump into a little bit of those two books. I haven't read any of your other books, so hopefully I'll get to them. But I have jumped into those two and trying my best to share them with as many people as possible. So if you will, would you give us a quick overview of, let's go with Canoeing the Mountains first, and just give us a kind of an overview of what the book is about. And then if it's all right with you, I've got some quotes from the book I'd like to just kind of read and then get your feedback on them.
Glad to, glad to.
Yeah.
So canoeing the mountains is really a metaphor that it uses the historical story of the
Yeah.
Lewis and Clark expedition to talk about how do you lead when you go off the map. That's what it basically is. When you're in
Yeah.
uncharted territory, when literally you no longer have a map to follow or anybody in your group who has experience at that
Yeah.
point, or at least that you don't think do. And so what it is it's a story about how they were trying to find the water route that would connect the Mississippi River to the Pacific Ocean. And that water route was the Missouri River that eventually they took all the way to its source, and then they climbed up the side of the Lemhi Pass and looked over and found the Rocky Mountains.
Yeah.
And the whole story is if you're on a canoe trip and you run into the Rocky Mountains, you got to do some changes if you're going to keep going, and you're going to have to
Absolutely.
adapt. And that's what really that story is about. It's how do you lead when you go off the map? And
Yeah.
there's a type of leadership that is called adaptive leadership that's actually shaped for exactly that moment. And so what I basically do in the book is I introduce Christian leaders to the concept of adaptive leadership that can be a really helpful, faithful way to lead forward when you don't have any best practices or
Yeah.
experts to guide you.
I'd say that was a great way of setting the book up with Lewis and Clark, because I learned not
Mm.
only some leadership principles and some things that I need to work on in my own life as a pastor and leader, but also learned a lot about Lewis and Clark, and
Yeah.
it gave me an interest in going and reading a little bit more about their history and their journey,
Mhm.
and some of the
Mhm.
obstacles that they ran into. So that was a great way to frame the book, by the way.
Oh, thank you. I'm
Yeah,
glad.
create a lot of interest to keep reading and keep learning.
Mhm.
Well, I'm going to jump into a little bit of canoeing the mountains, and then we'll flip over to resilience, and we'll kind of
Yeah.
walk through a few of these. And by the way, let me just say to our audience, if you're not familiar with Dr. Todd, please go and get his books, because you will be challenged, you will be encouraged. I promise you, you won't be the same, and you
Mm.
will learn a lot from Dr. Todd, not only just in the leadership principles he shares, but also in his experience and some of the history he brings in. A lot of great quotes. By the way, one of the books you reference several different times, and I believe it is in Canoeing the Mountains, is A Failure of Nerve. And I
Mhm.
picked that book up, and I'm working my way through it now. And I tell you
Good for you.
what a great book. I mean, that is, again, was not familiar, but that's
Yeah.
one things I love about reading, is that it just opens you up to some other authors and some other books. So again, thank you for that. Here's a comment that grabbed my attention, and I meditated on it a lot. And it's a very simple, concept, but it's so deep. And this is it's a little, just a little ways into the book of Canoeing the Mountains. It says, "Christian leaders, you were trained for a world that is disappearing." And I remember when I read that, I just kind of stopped and I started thinking, because this pandemic certainly has brought a lot of that, to my mind, that things have changed so much. I'd like to just hear a little bit more about what you mean by that. In other words, what's disappearing, and what do you think is replacing it?
Mm. So here's an interesting part, right? We all know and have all experienced the sense of disruption that the pandemic has brought, right?
Yeah,
Like everybody knows that things are really, really different today. Well, I wrote this book in 2013,
yeah,
right? I wrote it in a totally different time
yeah,
because the big change people were grappling with in 2013, it came out in 2015, was what I call the transition from Christendom.
yeah,
And what Christendom is where Christianity has kind of a home court advantage within a culture,
mhm,
right? So I would say, if you travel around the country as much as some of us do, you find that in almost every small town, it feels like it's the same, right? Like
yeah, right,
there's this town kind of courtyard, town square with a most famous dead guy on it. There's a library, there's a courthouse, and there's the first church of whoever got there first, right?
right,
There's first Baptist, first Methodist, first Lutheran, and all the other first churches are all on Second Street
mhm,
because everybody just agreed that the center of society was law, education, and religion,
mhm,
and even people who weren't Christians agreed that that would be Christian religion.
yeah,
So I worked at a church, for 10 years during the 80s and early 90s that in 1963, that church was the largest church in our denomination. It
mhm.
had 9,000 members.
My goodness,
It was featured in the Los Angeles Times, actually, and somebody gave me the newspaper clipping. But the most interesting part of the whole thing for me wasn't that it was featured in the Los Angeles Times. It's that the Los Angeles Times featured a week's
Yeah.
worth of daily Bible readings.
My goodness. Yeah.
So if you think about like the
Yeah.
major newspapers of America helping you with your morning quiet time,
Right.
well, then you understand that was the world that was a generation ago. That was
Yeah.
literally December 1963 was 4 months before I was born.
Yeah.
So one generation ago, the society supported Christianity, which is really very, very, very different today.
Yeah.
And what we have to grapple with is what are we going to do about it?
Mhm.
And some of us, all we want to do is go back. Like, let's just go back there. I think what God is doing is saying to us, look, that world has changed and I need you to be faithful in this new world.
Yeah.
So the world in front of you is really different than the world behind you. And we were trained for that world.
Yeah.
And now we need a different kind of training.
Yeah. It's interesting. You said it came out, I think you wrote it in 13, came out in 15. And
Mhm.
I read Resilience first, and then I went to Canoeing the Mountains. But I had to look at Canoeing the Mountains, the date, because it felt so relevant to where we are right now. And
Yeah.
I thought, man, he wrote this right almost at the beginning of the pandemic, had to, and then I
Yeah.
looked at it and said, no, it was much earlier. But I tell you what, it was just so applicable to where we are and so helpful and challenging. But that was one of the quotes that I just stopped. I shared that with our staff team. I said, look, I said, I have a young man, Preston, who's our student pastor. He just finished his MDiv and,
Mm.
came out in youth ministry and pastoral counseling. And I said, look, already, things have changed so much, and we're wrestling through what to do now and what to do post pandemic, and how to connect people who are not wanting to come to church as quick, as faithfully as they were before, and new questions and new fears and all those different things. So just that one quote alone caused a lot of discussion. So that was great.
Oh,
Let's
good.
move on. On page 40, you said, for most of us in ministry, our defaults that once worked so well are not working, and we become discouraged. So what do? We talk longer, we preach more, we try harder, we go into our bag of tricks and bring out our best programs. We give a personal touch. We hope that caring for stakeholders will inspire them to change.
Mm.
Basically, this is my thoughts. We simply do the same thing. We just do a whole lot more of it. And I tell you, I'm so guilty of that. I figure, well, I'll just preach more. I'll try this
Exactly.
harder. I'll just do it again. And I've been in our church here in North Carolina for 20 years, and the world's changed a lot in 20 years. And what
Mhm.
I used to be able to do 20 years ago that would attract some folks, and they found some life and hope, is not necessarily attracting their children.
Yes.
And I'm having to figure out, okay, I've been here 20 years and things are different today than they were then. But I do the same thing because I'm not sure what else to do.
Right.
It's I'm just not sure. So I keep trying. And that really spoke to me. And I'm sure that you're speaking to that in some of the seminary students there at Fuller, and trying to help them
Mhm.
to adapt to the current world.
Well, yeah, I see that whole notion that I always say this, think about being in a seminary. Like, right, every single person who comes to seminary, somebody said to them, "You're the best Christian I know. You should go pro.
Right.
Like,
Right.
you should go off to professional Christian school."
That's right.
And then we take them and we give them a master of divinity. Like, they
Mhm.
sound like a superhero, right?
Yep.
You
Yep.
send them into a congregation, and in some ways, they are the people who are most equipped, right?
Yep.
But what happens when people don't show up to listen to you teach the scriptures,
Yeah.
where the programs that we once run don't work, where you want to do pastoral care, you want to care for people, and you can't even find them in the hospital because
Right.
the hospital, they get checked out too fast. Or now with COVID, you can't even go
Yeah.
visit them. What we realize is we weren't prepared to think about how we make healthy adaptations, not just defaulting back to our old training, but keep learning.
Yeah.
And so then we get exhausted. I said it's like being in a canoe where there is no water in the river. You
Right.
can't tell people paddle harder. Like, they'll just exhaust themselves.
Yeah.
But that's what a lot of our leaders are doing today. They're trying to paddle harder. And we're actually, the truth is, the terrain has changed really
Yeah.
profoundly.
Yeah. I have a lot of friends in ministry, and that's exactly the way you described it is exactly right. I had a wonderful conversation with Dr. Chuck DeGroat
Mm,
recently, and he mentioned about, in counseling with pastors behind the scenes, he hears a lot of just guilt and shame because they don't feel like they can keep up. They're unable
Yep.
to change with the times as quickly as what's going on around them. And they see, of course, at the conferences, the churches that are doing so well, and they keep trying to do more of the same and not really knowing what to do. And again, that's one of those parts of the book. I sat down and I thought, that's me. I'm looking back, at what I used to do that worked, and I just
Mm-hmm.
think, okay, well, I'll just kind of bring out I love the phrase you use, the bag of tricks, and I
Mm-hmm.
certainly they don't feel like tricks, they
No.
feel like tools that work, and I'll just try it again, and it's just not as effective as it used to be, and that goes back to the world's changed so much.
Yeah. And that's really the part, the thing I work on every single day with leaders is um, learning the capacity to make wise, faithful
Yeah,
change
yeah,
in a changing world so that our unchanging reality of sharing the love of God with people will be able to be heard.
yeah,
That's really what we're working
yeah,
on. And this is sometimes we just go to kind of methods or techniques. I actually think that we need to go to deep learning in
yeah.
a different way.
That's so good. I want to get into a little bit of that in just a
Mhm.
moment. This is on page 51, another quote from your book. It says traditional churches will only become missionary churches as those in authority, and even those without formal authority, develop capacity to lead their congregations to a long, truly transformational process that starts with the transformation of the leaders and requires a thoroughgoing change in leadership functioning. So my question to you on that quote is, what needs to be transformed in the leader before he or she
Yeah.
tries to transform the congregation?
So let me. There's lots of pieces to it,
Sure.
but let me just boil it down to like two that are the most important.
Yeah.
In order to lead people through change, you have to have a high degree of trust.
Mm.
People have to trust you. They trust you because they believe that you are a person who is competent, right? Like when you open the scriptures, we actually get to hear someone who handles the scriptures well. When if we come ask you for counseling, you're actually caring and good at what you do, right?
Right.
If you're organize a group of people toward the mission of God, it's toward the mission of God. Like there's like that, what we call that technical competence has to be really high.
Mm.
You also have to be a person who is what we call relationally congruent. So when I coach and I work with people, I talk a lot about, are you the same person at the grocery store as you are
Mm.
in front of the pulpit? Like, do people experience you as being a trustworthy person? Now,
Yeah.
here's the challenge. To lead people through adaptive change literally means to lead them when you have to say to them with complete congruence, I'm not competent.
Mm.
I don't know what's next.
Mm.
I don't have a plan. But what I will do and what I am competent at is being a learner. I will lead you through a process where we'll learn together. And the good news about being a Christian is that the word for being a new Christian, the word that the scriptures use, disciple,
Yeah.
means learner. So what you're having to do is take people through a process of learning and learning together how to be faithful in this next step for the mission of God in the world.
Yeah.
And that's a really difficult part for most of us who are trained to be the expert.
Sure.
So the first thing you have to do, I say, is overcome the expert expectation.
Mm.
You're the one who has all the words. I remember being a young pastor and having someone say, we believe you will pray and God will speak to you, and whatever you tell us to do, we will submit. And I remember
Yeah.
going, oh my gosh, God
Yeah.
does speak to me, but he rarely gives me such clear plans.
Right.
Right? So what we have to work on is how do you lead people through the learning they need to take on
Mm.
so that together we might be transformed into the people God wants us to be.
Yeah, it almost sounds like we pastors sometimes forget that we're an example in all areas. So we're an example, of what we've learned from scripture, but we're also an example when we're ignorant and we don't know,
Exactly.
and try to model for them.
Yep.
Okay, what do you do when you face a problem in life and you don't know what to do? Well,
Yeah.
I'm gonna show you what you do. You admit
Yeah.
ignorance. You admit that
Yep.
there's a gap. You admit that you
Yep.
need to continue to learn and read, and maybe you need to go back to school. Maybe you need to go to a
Right.
different, training. And that's tough for us pastors, though, because we're so accustomed to people coming to us with questions, and we feel that we get paid to have the answers, and we feel like
Right.
we're failing them somehow if we say we don't know.
Yeah,
And
exactly. It feels very vulnerable.
it
I
does
mean,
very
I
much
mean,
so.
psychologists say that it's the three hardest words for a human to say are "I don't know."
Yeah.
Think
That's
about
so
that.
true.
Like, so to actually to help to believe that what God wants for us is to lead
Yeah.
people through a process of discipleship where we're going to discover more about God through our dependence and our humility
Yeah.
than we are through our expertise
Yeah.
and our experience is a
Yeah.
really challenging thing.
That's a huge change
Yeah.
for a lot of pastors. Wow. That's good. Page 53. I just got these
Mhm.
kind of quotes that jumped out at me. You said, today, preaching is not leadership, but
Yeah.
serves leadership. In a
Hmm.
changing world, there is so much more to leadership than speaking. And I
Yeah.
just want to say before you kind of give me some thoughts on that, you know, I've always worked on trying to speak well, hone that skill as much as I can. And again, I go back 15, 20 years ago, I could stand and give a reasonably good sermon, and people would really respond to it. And
Mm.
I'd say, hey, we need volunteers, and 20 people would sign up. That is most certainly changing. And there's
Yeah.
more great speakers today than ever before. TED Talks are available, at the click of your finger. There's great preachers everywhere, downloadable sermons everywhere. Unfortunately, the great sermon is almost like, a dime a dozen today. So you better have a whole lot more. Is that kind of
Yeah.
what you're saying in that part?
Kinda, yeah. It's
Yeah.
close to that. So I just did a webinar a couple of weeks ago with Christianity Today's
Mm,
preaching arm, Preaching Today, and we talked about this subject. So this is what I mean by it. In a Christendom world, in a world where people showed up and expected to hear something religious, even if you weren't Christian, right? People just
yeah.
came to church because it was part of what they did. Then leadership was oftentimes proclaiming and reminding people of what God wants for us
Mm,
and then challenging them to do something. Today, people don't show up.
that's right.
So,
Yeah.
and because so less people are showing up now, it's less than 50%
Yeah.
of the American public consider this some regular churchgoers,
Yeah.
and regular churchgoers report that they go 1.2 times a month.
Mm,
So just think about this. You're pastoring today. You might get 15 sermons a year. Well, at half an hour sermon, you
yeah.
get 7.5 hours. They get more content from their local news every week or their
Yeah.
favorite drive time DJ every
Yeah.
week than they get from us in a year. So preaching alone isn't going to form,
Mm,
and preaching alone isn't going to be enough about leadership. So what does preaching do? Preaching actually helps establish the relationship, and it establishes your competence at a critical skill, which is the
yeah.
scriptures. So then what happens is preaching helps people trust you more, and it helps people turn to God more. And then together you learn the capacity to lead people into the mission of God.
Yeah.
And so preaching, I say preaching serves leadership. So if you try to lead a congregation and you don't preach well and you're not faithful to the scriptures, they're not going to follow you anywhere.
Yep.
So you have to have it. But if you can't think that just good preaching alone is going to be enough to bring the kind of transformation we're talking about in a
Yeah.
changing
I
world.
remember reading that from you about the just the 1.2 times a month people attend, and I see that here a lot. We'll start a new series. They'll come to the first part, and they may not come back to the next part of the next series. They
Hmm.
didn't even hear part two, part three, part four of the series, and you're trying to build an overall thought. You're trying to guide them through a particular subject, or maybe a book of the Bible or whatever, and they're just getting bits and pieces of it. And of course,
Yeah.
in our world today, well, I watch online, I'll catch up online, but we're finding that isn't necessarily true. So
Yeah.
we're not speaking into the people's lives nearly as much as we used to, and there's a lot of other voices speaking into their lives. So
Yes.
it's a challenge. It's a real challenge. So on page 62, this is the last one from that particular book that we'll get into here. Is unless we demonstrate that we are credible on the map, no one is going to follow us off the map.
Yeah.
And I thought
Yeah.
that was so insightful. So what you spoke to this a moment ago, but just a
Yeah.
little bit more, maybe ways that a pastor, a Christian leader can build credibility. Let's imagine I've got some friends who have just walked into a church. They're new. And they're trying to kind of turn the church around, if you will. And they're going to need credibility, correct? I mean, that's
Yeah.
something
Oh,
that
yeah.
they're going to need. How would
Yeah.
you recommend that they start working toward building the credibility? They don't, obviously it's going to take a year or so for the people to hear their sermons and understand their competencies, but there are some things behind the scenes, no doubt, they could do to
Yeah.
build credibility with the people.
Well, so the first thing you do is you show up and be really clear about what it means to pastor these people.
Yeah.
right? So if you don't show up and, like I always say, like if you don't handle the scriptures well, you don't handle their souls well,
Yeah. Yeah.
you don't handle the tasks we have to do and the teams well, then no one's going to follow you when you ask them to sacrifice, to face loss, to go through learning, right?
Yeah.
They are going to say, we need you to do the stuff you do. We need you to do well. So,
Yeah.
I'm a real firm believer that there's a lot of shepherding and pastoring and teaching that are needed just to build a relationship with people where they trust you. And then as you're leading them off the map, you're leading them into the mission God has to you, the changes you need to go through. Well, then they will trust you because
Yeah.
they see that you've been credible.
Well,
And
but
so
define a
it's
little
really
bit the
important.
on the map, off the map, if you will.
Yeah.
What do you mean by that?
So on the map is so in the metaphor, it was in the river paddling the
Right.
canoes. They were expert river canoer people, right? So I always think of on the map skills are the things that everybody expects a pastor to do:
Yeah.
preach, teach, do pastoral care, run a good, healthy church, be a person
Right.
of integrity, like
Right.
those things, right? Um, then off the map is when you have to say, hey, the world is changing and we have to make some changes in our church. We can't give up preaching, teaching, pastoral
Right.
care, caring for souls, but we have to be able to think about what the changes are needed so that we can continue to be faithful to the mission that God's giving
Yeah.
us to reach new people and whatnot.
Yeah.
So on the map is where you are living out the skill set that you've been trained for, and off the map is where you are learning in real time and taking
Well,
people
I
through
feel like
change.
right now, Dr. Todd, that we're off the map all the time.
Well, that's just one of the reasons
That's
why
how I feel.
this conversation right
Yeah.
now is just so live. Is like,
Yeah.
so when I wrote the book in 2015, people would have conversations with me about whether there were places in the country that were post Christendom or not, whether you could just
Right.
keep doing the old things. Oh, not since March 13, 2020.
That's
Like
right. Yeah.
everybody went off the map, right?
Yeah. That's
And so
right.
now you're grappling. So what I would say is, what's on the map today? Well, do you still handle the scriptures well? Do people
Yeah.
know you care about them?
Yeah.
Right? Like, are we, it's not about just who shows up on a Sunday morning. Who's the flock entrusted to your care?
Yeah.
Like, is there a sense that this is a relational community of faith that is living out its faith together, even
Yeah.
if we're in a disjointed place? Now we can ask questions about what changes are needed
Yeah.
as we go forward.
Yeah. Well, that really spoke to me because, like I said, it just feels like we're off the map. In 20 years of ministry here, we faced a lot of obviously challenges, and we've had to add multiple services and build a new building and borrow money, and we've had to say goodbye to people who've transitioned out, and deaths and births and all the things that normally comes in church. And then in March, of 2020, everything shut down for 7 months. We had no church services. We had to scramble around to try to find how to connect people online, and continuing to do that. So what I'm saying is what hundreds of thousands of other pastors are going through, but it's just it feels like off the map. So that's one of the reasons that book spoke to me so much during the pandemic. So again,
Yeah.
thank you for writing that, and
Yeah.
hopefully other people will pick it up and read it. I could talk to you all day just on that one book, but
Yeah.
I want to move to the other one if I can, and that's Tempered Resilience. This was the first book of yours that I read, and overall, again, why did you write that particular book? What were you
Yeah.
hoping to accomplish in that?
Well, I would say that it always seems to be like that the Spirit speaks to me through some very personal conversation I have with somebody. So, Canoeing the Mountains was written because I had pastors say to me, "Seminary didn't train me for this world I'm in today."
Hmm.
I wrote Tempered Resilience because after I was traveling around the country talking about canoeing the mountains, I mean, I traveled 100,000 miles a year,
Wow.
and I'd go to different countries and talk about it. What would happen is eventually I started hearing over and over again someone would say to me, I don't know if we have anybody who can actually do that. That's really hard.
Yeah.
And the part that is the hardest is when your own people resist the leadership you're bringing to
Hmm.
bring change. It's the story of the Exodus, right?
Yeah.
Right after the Red Sea, the greatest miracle that we would see until the resurrection. The people of God are saved from Pharaoh's army through the miracle of God. They get to the other side. They are looking at the wilderness, going to head to the promised land. And 6 weeks after the greatest miracle any humans had ever seen, they're saying, maybe we should go back.
Yeah.
You know,
Yeah.
I didn't realize that we were going to be camping. I didn't realize the food would be short. I didn't realize that we'd be outside.
Yeah.
Moses, we really didn't want freedom. We just wanted some more straw for the
Yeah.
bricks.
Right.
You were supposed to negotiate as a better deal. We didn't want liberation. And what happens? They want to go back.
Yeah.
And if you talk to pastor after pastor after pastor, the most soul sucking thing, even in the pandemic, was not the pandemic. It was their own people who began to turn on each other, resist, walk away, leave the church because they said, hey, we're going to need to bring changes. We're going to need to face
Yeah.
the different world we're in.
Yeah.
And when the struggle for change became too high, resistance went high. And this was the most difficult thing for most pastors, is facing their internal resistance of their own people.
Yeah, that's so true. Well, that speaks right to the first quote I was going to mention, is that people do not resist change, they resist loss.
Yeah, yeah.
That was very helpful to me. And I realized it's not that they're fighting against, you're wanting to change this process or that process, so much as they're fighting against or feeling this sense of losing what they're comfortable with, and et cetera. I thought that was very
Yeah.
insightful.
Well, that's from Ronald Heifetz from
Yeah.
Harvard.
Yeah.
He's the guy who's the kind of the guru of adaptive leadership. And for me, I got to tell you, that was for me the my entry point to the whole thing. When I started realizing the people that I'm trying to lead, the people who asked me to lead them, right? They
Yeah.
asked me to reach out to their neighbors, help our
Right.
church grow, to make sure that we reach the non-Christian folks. And then when we started doing it, they don't want to do it.
Yeah.
I thought they're just so stubborn. And I realized,
Yeah.
oh, they're actually not stubborn. We're making changes to fulfill the thing they asked us to do, and they're experiencing the loss of it.
That's right.
I experienced this in the seminary. I came back to the seminary after it said 27 years of being a pastor, and one of my old professors was there. One of the professors, she was a brand new professor when I got there, and when I came back, we were talking about the changes we need to make in seminary education, and she looked at me and she said, "Todd, what happened to R. Fuller?" And it was great. I remember because it was a different day when I was there as a student in the late 80s and early 90s, as opposed to coming back today, where many of our students are online, many of them are part-time, many of them are involved in full-time ministry. It's not like we're like a graduate institution with a strong community. It's that we are distributed. Our students are all over the world.
Right.
So the change isn't that we're say that even students in seminaries and faculty need to make, isn't it really feels like loss. It feels like there used to be something that was what we called seminary education that isn't quite the same today. And the same thing's true with churches. It used to be, church used to feel like this, and it feels like we've lost our church. It's really about navigating and taking people through
It's
loss.
almost like some people are just going through a grieving process.
Oh, it's
because of
exactly
something
what it
that's
is, right? Yeah. I always say to pastors, so adaptive change that we talked about is really about taking people through learning. It requires learning. It results in loss. Those are the first two attributes. So what we have to say to folks is, as Christians, we should perk up our ears and say, okay, learning, that's what it means to be a disciple. Loss, oh, we were trained to help people with grief. What we we're not very good at is applying what we learned to do with individual people to whole communities and organizations.
Right.
And there is a skill set you can learn, just like you and I learned how to care for people who are going through having a death of a loved one. So.
Yeah, that's exactly right. I heard a therapist say recently that we do birth pretty well, but we don't do death very well.
Yeah.
And birth we plan for months and have all these parties and gifts and all this, and then when we go through death, we want to quickly get it over with as quickly as we can and move on. We don't know how to grieve. We're not sure what to do with all those emotions. And I think that's an excellent insight, that we have to almost look at the entire church maybe as going through a grieving process. What would you do with one person? Well, maybe you might need to do that with your entire team or your entire church and walk them through that. That's, again, part of discipling and part of pastoring. And again, in our culture, in the world in which I grew up and learning, all the conferences and so much of the church growth books was all about celebrating, and it was all about victory, and it was all about great things. But scripture is filled with weeping, and it's filled with brokenness and it's filled with questions, and we don't know how to do that well again.
Yeah.
We just
Yeah.
don't know
There's a
how.
whole book in the Bible called
That's
Lamentations.
exactly right.
And,
Yeah,
I don't know when was the last time we preached through
yeah,
Lamentations, right?
that's right. Yeah.
We don't have a
Well,
book in the Bible called, Celebration.
that's right. Yeah, you're right. Well, you write that talking about grieving and some of the negative things, you write that sabotage is normal.
Yeah. Yeah.
In fact, you say that if you're a leader, you should expect sabotage.
Yeah.
Please explain to our audience, what do you mean by sabotage, and how could something that sounds so horrible even possibly be normal?
Yeah. So you mentioned Ed Friedman's book, Failure of Nerve.
Yeah.
This is where this comes from. What Ed Friedman was genius at saying was, look, this is what humans do when they're facing the unknown. So I always say to people, think about this. The root word for familiar and family are the same root word,
Mm-hmm.
which means that when you're in an unfamiliar place or going through an unfamiliar experience, you don't just feel disoriented, you feel unfamilied.
That's good.
So you feel abandoned, you
Yeah.
feel like you're lost, right? And you feel like you're orphaned. So what do you do when you feel abandoned or orphaned? You want to run back home to anything that's safe. Well, if you're taking people through a change process and you say, hey, we're not going back to Egypt, we're going forward to this place called the Promised Land, but we have to go through a wilderness to get there.
Yeah.
It's really hard. People always want to go back. Sabotage is about wanting to go back. And I always say that the thing to remember about sabotage is it's not the bad things that evil people do. It is the human things that anxious people do. When we get really anxious, we want to go back to what's familiar, and very often we'll stop the very
Yeah.
change or transformation that God wants for us.
That alone, that one insight there could save so much pain. Because I remember in my early years of pastoring, everything felt so personal.
Yes.
If I wanted to change the music and people didn't like it, I just somehow equated that with they don't like me.
Exactly.
If I preached differently, or let them in a series they had never heard before. And I remember the first time I sat down on a stool and began to teach it. Really, people just couldn't understand why I was sitting. They were so accustomed
Yes.
to the preacher walking across the stage and being a little bit more evangelical in the approach. And again, I took it personal, and I would allow that to offend me. And it's embarrassing to say, I would say maybe something a little smart aleck back, or trying to come on, people, get with the game, and learning over time that it's really not about you. It's about
Yes.
their world changing, and you're taking something very sacred, their church, their style of preaching. Maybe they gave their life to Christ under a particular style, and it means a lot to them. And
Yeah.
over the years, I've had to learn that, man, it's not about you.
Yeah. Well,
that's a hard lesson to learn.
oh, it's profoundly hard because it
Yeah,
feels very personal,
it
right?
does.
So
Yeah.
so to recognize, so Ed Friedman goes so far as to say that, if you're trying to bring a change, and it's a change that, we believe is the conviction of the Holy Spirit leading us in a direction for change. He's trying to bring a change. He goes, you can't think you've been a success until after you have made the change,
Mm.
then survived the sabotage.
Yep.
The sabotage comes every single time. It always comes after you've made the change. When people start experiencing the pain, when
Yeah.
people are now experiencing, hey, we're in the wilderness and there's not as much food as there was even for when we compared to when we were in slavery, and it's staying the course through that process so that they can kind of grow in their own
And
resilience. And that's what
staying
resilience
in the
is.
process, as you say,
Yeah.
that separates the good from the great leaders.
Mhm.
I mean,
Yeah.
that
Yeah.
really separates, because a lot of us can start the process.
Yep.
It's carrying through with the process that really separates them. So that was so
Yeah.
insightful. Well, one other quote from the book, on page 63, you quote Oswald and Jacobson. You say the emotional competencies of pastors and church leaders are probably the most important factors in pastoral effectiveness. So I would say that's where the emotional competencies come into play with the sabotage and with all those different things.
Yes.
Speak a little bit to the emotional capacities, because a lot of times you don't hear that when you go to conferences. A lot of times they're not talking about, they're trying to give you all these skills,
Right.
how to double the church, how to reach more people, how to preach better. But no one, well, I shouldn't say no one, but I think it's a little bit more out there today than it used to be. But they didn't talk a lot about the emotional weight that it has on you, how to
Yep.
deal with what you feel are personal attacks, what to do when people are sabotaging you. So talk a little about the emotional capacities of pastors, the competencies, I should say.
Well, it's interesting. Here, you and I are talking. We're both older and experienced pastors,
Yeah.
and both of us would probably say there was a time in our lives when
Yeah.
we took everything way too serious,
That's
too
right.
personally, right?
Yeah. Right.
Emotional capacity is your capacity to be able to, like, one way. When I coach people, I say, look, I just need you for this thing to separate yourself from your
Mm,
role.
mm,
They probably think you are a fine human being.
yeah.
They hate that in your role you have to disappoint them. It's like being the referee in a
Yeah.
game.
Yeah.
Half the group are going to yell at you the whole time.
Yeah.
They're not most of the time they're not picking on your children or
Right.
telling you you're ugly. They're upset at your role.
Yeah.
Now, let's be clear, when they're mad, people are mad, people are mad, and if we
Yeah.
take it personally, they get angry at you. But if you can manage your own reactivity, if you cannot take it personally, you can actually calm the situation down and do better because you can continue to work people through the process.
Yeah.
So, one of the first things you have to figure out is, can you develop the emotional non reactivity, as they talk about it? Your capacity to stay focused on the thing that God's called you to do, stay focused on the task you have to do.
Yeah.
And
Well,
that's really hard.
it is very hard. I can't speak, of course, to all other careers and all the other, areas of leading in the business world, et cetera. But it seems as if that is especially challenging for pastors
Yeah.
because of, very few. My wife worked with the state for nearly 20 years in education and all the different things. She left that most of the time, left it at work when she came home. She didn't have a lot of her colleagues that she was friends with, in social media. They didn't celebrate birthdays together. They certainly didn't celebrate deaths of their family members together,
Mhm.
and all these different things. But in church, your world, your professional, your personal world is so married, and
Yeah.
you're preaching to some of the same people you also celebrate their birthdays, their wedding
Yes.
anniversaries. You go to the rooms at the hospital when a baby is born, and it feels extremely personal when those very same people want to criticize some of your skills or
Yes.
criticize decisions you make. So the emotional competencies of a pastor, it seems like they almost have to be better than almost any other area of a career or any other area of leading. It just seems like to me, because it's
Yeah.
really a
So
tough one.
the closest analogy for those of us, if you've got folks who are like church members who are listening to this, is it's like running a family business. The church is
Yeah,
really a family business. We're a family. We have inherent relationships. We are brothers and sisters, whether we like it or not. We are stuck with each other.
yeah,
But we are a family that has a business. It's called participating in the mission of God. It's to be the
yeah,
answer to the prayer, your kingdom come, your will be done on earth, right?
right,
It is the Great Commission. There's a charge we've been given. So now we have these competing values. We have to grapple with the fact that we inherently love each other no matter what we do, and we have something to do.
yeah,
And so it's very hard when you're the leader of that, when you're saying, look, I will love you no matter what. I want this to be a safe place for you to experience the love of God. And now we are also going to be moving forward to make an impact on the community. And especially when people are, on our staff or
yeah,
our leaders, it's really complicated. And
yeah,
that's it's one of the reasons why, one of the famous Peter Drucker, who is a management leader, said
yeah,
that he thought that along with like a small town mayor and hospital administrator and president of a university, he thought being a pastor was one of those hardest
yeah,
jobs. And the reason why they were hard is they had multiple constituents with differing ideas that you
mhm,
had to hold on to, multiple stakeholders who have profoundly different
yeah.
goals.
That's so true. Wow. Well, I want to move away from those two books and just kind of a few questions at the end of this, if it's
Yeah.
okay.
Yeah,
Take it
sure.
just a little bit different direction. Um, I'd like to know where do you see the church? I mean, you're with these
Mm,
leaders, every day training these younger. I'm sure they're varying ages, but many of them are
yeah.
going into ministry soon.
Yeah.
All the pandemic, the things you're reading, especially in the U.S. Where do you see the church moving in a decade or two? What I know you can't predict it, but where do you see the church of the future, if you will? What are some thoughts maybe that you have about that?
Yeah, that's an interesting question, Scott, because so I do work at a seminary. So I work with students who are getting trained, but I work mostly in the doctor of ministry department. So I work
Okay.
with experienced leaders coming back
Okay.
to get training. And I spend all my day coaching and consulting and working with leaders on the front line. So I work mostly with more senior leaders than I work with emerging leaders. And here's the interesting thing that I've said is I think the world now makes us think about that question differently. Like in the 1990s, people used to quote Wayne Gretzky, the hockey player, skate to where the puck is
Right.
going.
Right.
Well, what if we live in a world that has 4 pucks going in 4 different directions?
Yeah.
So I
So
think
true.
the future is not going to be who can predict and who can get there. It's going to be, if to use a different phrase, who can prototype,
Hmm.
who can do small experiments, who can learn as they go, who can learn to not waste a crisis because you're going to learn through it. So I would say right now that what I'm noticing, and I speak 150 times a year,
Yeah.
and I coach I'm working with over 50 congregations at the moment. What I'm aware of is the churches where people say we are going to learn, we're going to take risks, we're going to experiment, we're going to, if it doesn't work, we're going to say it's not about whether it worked, what did we learn, and we're going to keep moving. Those churches move forward. They look to the future. The churches that are like, we want security, we want to get comfortable, we want to go home, we want what's familiar. I think those churches are going to struggle deeply.
Yeah.
And so the
And
question here is, are you willing to be a church that's willing to not waste this crisis
no,
by learning in through the middle of it and moving
no,
forward one
that's so
step at a
good.
time?
And I imagine you would recommend a pastor just to say that to the congregation. Hey, we're trying some new things here. They may
Yep.
work, they may not work. We're going
Yep.
to do the absolute best we can to
Yep.
figure this thing out as we go.
Yeah, and I would say to the congregation, hey, we're going to try a lot of new things, and we're not even going to worry if they work. We're going to ask ourselves, what are we learning?
Okay.
Experiments are like, think about a scientist.
Yeah.
Experiments are about learning. So the question
Yeah.
isn't, hey, did this thing work? It's what did we learn? And if we learn, for example, that hey, a lot of our people can stay connected online, well, then we're going to work on some online stuff. If we
Right.
learn that, hey, our online education or our online worship is breaking down our community, well, then we're going to figure out how well, the question we want to ask is, how do we develop deeper community? And it's just
Yeah.
creating a mindset of curiosity and learning and experimenting
That's
requires
great.
creating a
That
culture of
that
safety.
rather than trying to figure out where we're going to go tomorrow, really be fully present in today and
Yes,
accept what is in front of you rather than trying to anticipate 10 years down the road, because we live in such a, I'm just kind of repeating back some of the things you're saying that's clicking in my mind. It sounds like to me our world is changing so quickly and so fast, no one can really predict, because we don't even
exactly.
know where we're going to be 2 years from today, let alone 10 years.
Yeah.
So take where you are, learn from you can, adapt as quickly as possible, learn from it, and be as good as you can be where you are.
Yeah. So
Yeah.
when Canoeing the Mountains came out in 2015, I think I did like 1 or 2 podcasts.
Hmm.
I've done dozens. I did 2 today.
Wow.
Like,
Yeah.
right. In March 13th, 2020, I got off a plane and I had 15 speaking engagements canceled. At the time, I
Yeah.
used to have 30 a year. I'd get on a plane 30
Yeah.
times a year,
Yeah.
more than 2 times a month. I thought I'm not going to do any speaking in the next year. I did
Yeah.
170 webinars. Like
Wow.
I didn't know how to do that 20 months ago. Like we're learning all
That's
the
right.
time and
That's so
things are
good.
changing so fast. There's this great quote by Eric Hoffer. In times of great change, the learners inherit the earth.
Mm.
Learners inherit the earth. The learned find themselves beautifully equipped for a world that no longer exists.
Wow.
And those who are willing to be learners, and which is, again, disciples, to be learners, to be humble, to be experiment, to try things, they're going to move forward.
Yeah.
And those who want to be the experts are going to be the experts of the past that
I
doesn't
gotta I gotta
exist
write that
anymore.
quote down. That's so
Yeah,
good. The
yeah,
learners inherit the earth. That's
yeah.
great. Well, hey, what you're traveling around talking to different churches and consulting. What concerns you about kind of where we are in our society, and what is something that kind of bothers you with what you see that you would love
Yeah.
to maybe speak into?
Well, thank you for asking. So during the pandemic, I would often say that I believe that the pandemic didn't cause problems; it revealed them. That it was apocalyptic, kind of like the Book
Yeah,
of Revelation. It gets up revealed.
right.
So I would say, there are 4 things that show up that I talk about all the time that have been revealed by almost every leader I talk to. The number one is I think we have a crisis of discipleship.
Yeah,
We have too many of us realized, man, we went through a crisis and we didn't act very Christian. We acted an awful lot like whatever we were seeing in the world. The world got all divisive. We got divisive, right? The world got all started arguing over things like, vaccines and masks and stuff. We did, right? We didn't look like salt and light. We didn't look like something different. So we have a crisis of discipleship. And it's not true in every place, but many. We have a crisis of community. I mean, I have pastors I work with every day. One of the pastors I coach is from a great church in the South. And he said, you know what, I have baptized their children. I have helped them bury their loved ones. I have been with them through marital problems. I've been with them in hospital rooms where we prayed to see their children make it through surgery. And they get mad at one thing I say and they change churches.
Yeah.
Like it's just like the sense that we are community, we're members of one another, we're brothers and sisters in Christ, and we treat the church like, well, if I don't like this, I'll go to the one down the street.
Right.
That consumeristic approach to both discipleship and community is really hurting the church at a lot of levels.
Yeah.
And I think that leads to the third one, which is we don't have nearly enough leadership development. There are not enough leaders to be able to be in a distributed church. We need more people who have leadership capacities and discipleship capacities who could lead small groups of people in discipleship better.
Yeah.
And I think the fourth one is we've realized the Bible is filled with wisdom about how God cares about justice. And we haven't figured out how to talk about justice in any way that's different than the world. We sound either overly reactive or we sound overly defensive, and we have not become the kinds of people who bring the justice that you see of God all the way through.
Yeah. Well, my final question had to do with a possible book that maybe you'll be thinking about. I was thinking that those four right there alone could lead into an incredible book and really open up the eyes of a lot of church leaders about some of the things that we need to be really looking to and think deeply about. So what do you have a kind of a book in mind or something?
Well, I have a contract for a book.
Okay.
Yeah. So the book the book
Yeah.
I am working on is on discipleship. Basically, it's a book.
Excellent.
It's a book about discipleship. It's a book about how do you disciple people so they will have this capacity to faithfully change for the sake of the mission of God in the world. So the discipleship is no longer about trying to support the institutions of the past, but create the missional capacities for the future. And so it's really a discipleship meets adaptive change.
Any prediction on when that may be available?
Well, I know it's going to be available because I have a deadline.
Okay.
So it'll be available in fall of 2022.
Great. Well, I look forward to that.
Oh, excuse me, fall of 2024. Fall of 2024.
Okay, so two more years. Okay.
Yeah.
Well, we look forward to that and continuing to learn from you. Well, Dr. Todd, thank you for your time today. I know you're very busy, got a lot of other things going on, but you were so kind to take some moments and share with us some insights. And my hope is that more people will grab your books and follow you and check out things online, maybe social media as well, and just keep up with what you're doing, what you're learning, what you're sharing, because you're certainly a gift to the church.
Yeah. Hey, can I just say this one thing?
Sure.
If people want to connect to the work I do, there's this little thing my staff came up with. You can just text the word change, CHANGE,
Okay.
to 66866.
Great.
Change 66866. Too many sixes for a pastor,
Yeah.
but
That's unique. Yeah.
That's a word that they gave me. But if
Yeah.
you text the word change to 66866, what you will get is a connection to the center that I lead that gives resources about this. It's called the Church Leadership Institute. Yeah.
That's great. Well, thank you again, Todd.